She once rocked him to sleep when his parents were too busy to notice, but now, at 85, she's scrubbing floors to survive. When Keanu Reeves sees her again after decades, he makes a quiet decision that will shake the world. What happened between them, and why was her name erased from his past? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The wind had a gentle bite that morning as Keanu Reeves stepped out of a nondescript sedan onto a quiet Toronto street. He had chosen the neighborhood precisely for its anonymity. No cameras, no gawking fans, just the ordinary rhythm of city life. For Keanu, it was a welcome break from the noise of Los Angeles. He was scouting indie film locations, something he liked to do personally when time allowed. The story he was working on was small and intimate, set in neighborhoods like this one. Quiet, working class, lined with aging row houses and small businesses that had refused to vanish. He tugged his beanie lower, zipped up his jacket, and crossed the street to a small cafe tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore. It was the kind of place that still had handwritten chalkboard signs and mismatched mugs stacked behind the counter. The smell of cinnamon and coffee drifted out through the open door as a barista propped it with a rubber wedge. Keanu paused for a moment, breathing in the comfort of it. That was when he saw her. She was just outside the cafe entrance, on her knees with a spray bottle in one hand and a cloth in the other. An older woman, probably in her 80s, wearing a tan windbreaker and faded sneakers. Her back was slightly hunched, but there was precision in her movements. She wasn't just cleaning the glass. She was tending to it with care, making slow, circular motions like someone who had done this for decades. Keanu almost walked past. He was mid-step when a flicker of familiarity stopped him. Something about the curve of her shoulder, the rhythm in her hands, the soft hum escaping her lips. It lit up a part of his memory he didn't know was still alive. He turned, subtly, and looked again. She wiped down the last pain and slowly stood, wincing as her knees straightened. Then she glanced sideways toward the street, and their eyes met. His heart thudded once, sharply. She didn't recognize him. Not yet. Her eyes lingered only for a second before she looked down and packed up her cloth and spray bottle into a canvas bag. Her hair was mostly gray, pulled back in a tight braid. Her face bore the softness of age and the kind of dignity that had nothing to do with wealth or power. He stepped closer, cautiously, unsure if he should say something. The moment felt fragile, like speaking too quickly might make it vanish. But the memory in his mind was already awake, clear and specific. Her voice, 25 years ago, whispering gently as she tucked him into bed when his mother was late. Again. Her name came back before he even realized he was thinking it. Dolores. He cleared his throat softly. The sound was enough to make her glance up again. This time, her eyes lingered a beat longer. There was no immediate recognition, just polite curiosity. "Excuse me," he said gently, his voice steady but low. "Are you Dolores Alvarez?" She looked at him, puzzled, then took a hesitant step closer. Her brow furrowed slightly as if pulling at a memory buried deep. Then her eyes widened, not with shock, but with a dawning warmth. "Oh," she whispered, her voice cracking with time. "Little Keanu." It wasn't a name shouted in awe or reverence. It was spoken the way someone remembers an old song. Familiar, soft, and full of something lost. Keanu smiled and nodded. "It's been a long time." Dolores looked at him like she was trying to measure what remained of the boy she once knew. "You've grown into your face," she said, "but your eyes, those haven't changed." They stood in silence for a moment, two very different lives intersecting again on a chilly Toronto sidewalk. Keanu reached out, and she took his hand without hesitation. Her skin was papery thin, but her grip was strong. "What are you doing here?" he asked. She motioned to the cafe behind her. I come by twice a week. Help them keep the windows clean. A few dollars here, a few there. I like to stay busy." He felt something twist in his chest. It was hard to reconcile. The image, Dolores, who once quietly watched over him like a guardian angel, now scrubbing windows for spare cash at 85. But her tone wasn't bitter. She said it like someone stating the weather. "Do you live nearby?" he asked. She nodded. "Basement unit on Dundas. It's small, but I manage." He wanted to ask a dozen more questions, but he held back. She had always been private, even when she was in their home every day. She never spoke much about her life, just listened, observed, and gave whatever comfort she could without needing thanks. "I didn't think you'd remember me," she said after a pause. He looked her in the eyes. "How could I forget you?" She smiled, and it was the same smile he remembered from the nights she used to bring him a warm glass of milk when the world outside felt too loud. "Come, let me buy you something warm," he said. She shook her head gently. "I've still got 2 more stops this morning. The Jenkins family," he's had back surgery, "and Mrs. McCormick's place. She's not well enough to keep up." He didn't press. He simply offered, "Tomorrow, maybe? Lunch?" She considered it, then nodded. "Lunch sounds nice." As she walked away, slow and steady, Keanu watched the woman who had once been a silent pillar in his young life disappear into the city crowd. Still working, still giving, still unseen by most. But not by him. That night, Keanu sat in his hotel room, staring at the quiet glow of the city through a tall window. He couldn't shake the image of her bent over those glass doors, not just working, but still moving with that same care and intention she always had. Dolores had never treated anything as just a job. Whether folding laundry or wiping a spill, she brought dignity into every gesture, as if the act itself deserved respect. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a napkin she had handed him before leaving, her handwriting still careful and elegant, despite her age. It read simply, "Tomorrow, 12:30, Cafe Verde." Her penmanship hadn't changed much. As a child, Keanu had watched her write grocery lists in that same looping style. She'd always write milk last, even if they already had some, because she remembered he liked to warm it before bed. And she'd always ask if he wanted cinnamon on top, even when they didn't have any. She remembered small things, important things, things nobody else noticed. He leaned back and let the memories in. The way she hummed Spanish lullabies when he couldn't sleep. The way she covered for his mother's absences without ever judging. The quiet way she defended him once when a stranger at the door had raised their voice. She had stepped forward, not with anger, but with a calm, unwavering look that made the man back down instantly. He had never asked about her life, not really. Back then, he was just a kid, caught up in his own world. And later, when his acting career took off, he'd lost touch with many people from that time. But now, sitting alone in a warm hotel room while she still worked to make ends meet, he felt something else stirring. Guilt wasn't the right word. It was deeper than that. It was awareness of how many people like Dolores existed in silence, of how many built the foundations of lives they were never fully part of how many gave everything they had, only to fade quietly into the background. Not anymore. Keanu folded the napkin and set it beside his phone. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, or how she would respond to the questions he'd barely begun to form. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let her story end with a forgotten glass door on a cold Toronto morning. There were things he needed to remember, and things the world needed to know. The next day arrived with a gentle drizzle and overcast skies, the kind that made Toronto feel like it was holding its breath. Keanu walked to Cafe Verde in a dark coat and baseball cap, moving quietly through the neighborhood. He spotted her before she saw him. Dolores was seated by the window, her canvas bag beside her, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She wore the same tan windbreaker and a burgundy scarf that looked older than he was. Her face was turned toward the window, watching the rain trace patterns down the glass. He stepped inside and approached slowly. She turned at the sound of the bell over the door, and when she saw him, her face softened instantly. "You came," she said, standing up. "Of course," Keanu replied. "I wouldn't miss this." They hugged again, longer this time. Her arms were thin but steady. There was no small talk, just presence. They sat across from each other, and for a while, neither spoke. Dolores was the first to break the silence. "You've done well for yourself," she said, with a faint smile. "I see your face sometimes, on posters, in magazines at the market." Keanu smiled back. "I owe a lot of that to the people who took care of me. Like you." She waved her hand lightly, as if brushing away a compliment. "I just did what I knew how to do." That was more than enough. She looked down at her tea. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me. You were so young." "I remembered everything," he said gently. Dolores took a sip of tea and then reached for a small paper napkin, folding it carefully in her lap. She always had nervous hands, he remembered, always folding, straightening, smoothing. It was how she carried her calm. He noticed her shoes, plain sneakers, well worn, the soles nearly gone. Her scarf was mended in 3 different places, but her eyes held that same clarity he remembered from years ago. Only now, they looked heavier. Not dimmed, but tired in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep. "I still work," she said, almost casually. "A few houses, a church on weekends. I help out where I can." Keanu's eyebrows knit together. "You shouldn't have to." Dolores shrugged. "I like to stay useful." He looked at her carefully. "Being useful doesn't mean working yourself to the bone." She chuckled softly. "Work is how I've always prayed, mijo. It's how I feel connected to the world." Keanu leaned forward. "Where are you living now?" "Basement apartment off Dundas," she said. "It's not much, 1 window, but it opens. I've got a little heater. I'm okay." Keanu nodded, but inside, his heart was twisting. There was no pride in her words, only acceptance. The kind that comes from a lifetime of doing without and never asking for more. Dolores reached into her bag and pulled out a small wrapped bundle, aluminum foil folded with care. She placed it on the table and pushed it toward him. "I made you something," she said. "It's silly, just tamales. The kind you used to like. I wasn't sure if you still ate them." Keanu smiled and unwrapped the edge, letting the scent hit him. Corn husk, steam, and memory. The smell brought him back to early mornings when she would leave one on the counter before heading out, always labeled with his name in pen. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she replied. "But I wanted to. It's the one thing I know how to give." He nodded, fighting the lump forming in his throat. They ate slowly, sharing a quiet peace that didn't need explaining. She asked about his movies, not with starstruck interest but with maternal concern, whether the travel was tiring, if he was eating properly on set, if he was being treated well. He answered each one honestly. She listened carefully, as if each word mattered. When he asked about her daughter, she looked away briefly. "Lucio moved to Vancouver," she said. "She has 2 kids now. We talk sometimes, but she has her hands full." "Do they visit?" he asked. "Not really," she answered, "but they're doing okay. That's what matters." He knew better than to pry. Dolores had always protected her daughter's privacy like a shield, but there was a quiet sadness in her voice, one he didn't remember hearing before. "You know," she added after a pause, "I never thought I'd still be cleaning houses at this age, but I'm grateful. My legs still work. My mind still works. There are people worse off." Keanu looked at her hands resting on the table. The skin was paper-thin, speckled with age, the veins raised like old tree roots, but they were still steady, still strong. "You shouldn't be working anymore," he said softly. She gave a small laugh. "And what would I do if I stopped?" Live, he said. Rest. Paint. You used to paint, didn't you? She nodded slowly. Long ago. I stopped after my husband died. Didn't feel right anymore. Keanu leaned back. Would you ever want to start again? She tilted her head and gave him a look. You always had a way of making things sound easy. He smiled. Sometimes they are. We just forget how to let them be. Dolores grew quiet, her gaze drifting back out the window. The rain had stopped, but the glass was still streaked with droplets. I didn't expect this today, she said. I didn't expect you. I didn't expect you either, Keanu replied. But I think maybe I needed to. They walked together after lunch, down the quiet side street toward the bus stop. Dolores refused a ride, waving off the idea like a breeze. You don't need to fuss over me, she said. I've been taking the 505 for years. Keanu slowed his steps to match hers. She moved at a gentle pace, her balance careful, her breath slightly labored on the inclines. But she didn't complain once. In fact, she seemed more concerned about whether he had a busy afternoon ahead. Are you still filming something? She asked. Scouting locations, he said. Looking for something small, personal. I like to walk the streets, see what places feel like. Dolores smiled. You always liked stories that felt real. They stopped at the corner near the bus shelter. Keanu glanced at the handwritten notice taped to the pole. It listed lost gloves, a missing cat, and a community potluck. The paper fluttered gently in the breeze. It reminded him of the bulletin boards Dolores used to read on their way to the market, always scanning for ways to help or contribute. She was always looking out for others, even strangers. Do you ever think about retiring? He asked suddenly. She gave him a small, tired smile. Every time my knees ache, but I also think, who will visit Mrs. McCormick if I don't? Who will keep the Jenkins family's kitchen from falling apart? You don't have to carry all that anymore. Maybe, she said, but I still can. The bus rumbled in the distance. She pulled her scarf tighter, then looked up at him one last time before boarding. You were a good boy, she said. Kind, quiet, thoughtful. I never doubted you'd grow into someone good. Keanu smiled. You helped raise me, Dolores. She patted his arm. I just did the dishes. Then she stepped onto the bus, found a seat by the window, and gave him a small wave as it pulled away. Keanu stood there until the bus disappeared from view. Then he turned, walked slowly back the way they came, and reached for his phone. His fingers hovered for a moment before he dialed. He wasn't sure exactly what he would do yet. But the moment he saw her at that glass door, something had shifted inside him. It wasn't just about helping an old friend. It was about honoring something that had been lost in the noise of his life. Dolores had given him quiet shelter in a chaotic world. Now it was his turn, and he wouldn't fail her. That night, Keanu lay awake in his hotel room. The city outside murmured softly, streetlights casting dull shadows across the ceiling. But his mind wasn't on the present. It had drifted to another Toronto, decades earlier. A boyhood shaped by too much silence and not enough certainty. And in the center of those memories stood a quiet, constant presence. Dolores. She had started working for his mother when Keanu was barely 6. At first, she came 3 times a week, cleaning, folding laundry, preparing meals. But after his father left for good and his mother took on more jobs, Dolores became something more. She came nearly every day. Sometimes she arrived before sunrise, sometimes she stayed until long after dark. Always calm, always gentle. Keanu remembered the soft clink of her keys, the scent of lavender she used in the laundry, and the way she would leave tiny, folded towels on his bed, shaped like little boats. He used to pretend they were sailing him away to some other world. He never told her that, but he remembered how it made him feel. Safe. There were nights when he'd wake up to find the house empty, his mother out working or attending auditions, and every time, without fail, Dolores would be there. not hovering, not intruding, just present. She never tried to replace anyone. She simply sat with him, sometimes knitting, sometimes telling stories from her village in Mexico. Stories about mountains and mango trees, festivals filled with music, and fireflies that lit up the sky like stars. Keanu didn't always understand the details, but he understood the feeling. Warmth, security, a heartbeat of peace in a home that often trembled with uncertainty. One night stood out more than the rest. He had gotten into a fight at school. Nothing serious, but enough to send him home bruised and quiet. His mother hadn't been home that evening. It was Dolores who found him curled up on the couch, staring at the carpet like it held answers. She didn't scold or ask questions. She simply brought him a bowl of soup, sat beside him, and after a while said, "You don't have to talk, but when you're ready, I'll listen." He didn't speak that night, but he remembered the weight of her hand resting gently on his shoulder, like an anchor keeping him from drifting too far. Looking back now, he realized that was what she had always done, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, silently. She had held things together in the background so he could find his way forward. She never asked for praise or recognition. She never demanded anything. And yet, she had given everything. Keanu remembered the day he booked his first real acting job. He was 19, nervous, and still uncertain if he belonged in the world he was chasing. He came home late that evening, holding the script in his hands, and Dolores was there, folding towels as always. When she looked up and saw the expression on his face, she didn't ask what happened. She simply smiled and said, "You did it." That night she made pozole, even though it wasn't planned. She lit a candle and played soft music from a small radio she kept in the kitchen. It wasn't a party, but it was a celebration, quiet and sincere, like everything she did. Keanu hadn't told his mother yet, but Dolores somehow knew. He thought of her now and realized how little he had understood her back then. As a child, she had seemed timeless. As a teen, she had been the person he could always count on. And when his career took him away from home, he simply assumed, wrongly, that she would always be okay. She never wrote, she never called. That wasn't her way. But he saw her now with different eyes. He saw the worn shoes, the scarf held together with hidden stitches, the way she brushed off her aches like they didn't matter. She had been giving her whole life, and the world had let her slip through the cracks. He thought about all the rooms she had cleaned, all the meals she had prepared, all the days she had quietly stayed behind to make sure he didn't feel forgotten. And he remembered something else. There was a week just after his 14th birthday when he came home from school and found Dolores crying quietly in the kitchen. She had tried to hide it, wiping her face quickly, blaming it on onions, but he had seen it, and he had asked if she was okay. She had smiled through tears and said, "Sometimes even grown-ups get tired." He had never forgotten that moment. He just hadn't known what to do with it. Now he did. Because it wasn't just that Dolores had helped raise him. It was that she had done so invisibly, without asking for anything in return. She had shaped his view of the world, of kindness, of strength. And in all his years of interviews, all the stories he had told about mentors and influences, he had never once mentioned her. But now it was all he could think about. How could someone so essential be forgotten by the very world she helped build? That question would not leave him. Keanu sat up in bed, his thoughts still circling as dawn broke outside his hotel window. A soft glow filtered through the curtains, but he didn't notice. His mind was elsewhere, drifting through memories that had waited patiently in the corners of his heart. Dolores had never spoken much about her past. He knew only fragments. That she had come to Canada in her early 30s, that she had worked as a nurse in Mexico but couldn't get certified here, that she had a daughter and a husband who passed away when Lucia was still young. The rest she kept to herself. But what he did know, what he could feel even now, was that her love had been steady, not loud, not obvious, but unwavering. He remembered how she used to hum as she swept the hallway, how she folded his socks into perfect pairs, how she left tiny post-it notes when she had to leave early. "Don't forget lunch," one would say, or "You are loved." Simple words, but they carried weight, more than he ever realized back then. And now she was 85, still working to survive, still showing up with lunch wrapped in foil and a smile that asked for nothing in return. He couldn't accept it, not anymore. She had been more of a parent to him than most. She had stood in the shadows of his life while others stood in the spotlight. She had never asked to be seen, but now he saw her, fully. He got up, dressed quickly, and stood by the window again. His reflection stared back at him, older now, more aware. The child in his memories had grown into a man who could finally understand what those small moments meant. He picked up his phone and began typing a message to his assistant. It wasn't a question, it was a plan. "I want everything you can find on Dolores Alvarez. Background, address, employment history, living conditions, quietly. No media, and I want it today." He sent it and stood there for a long moment, heart steady, purpose clear, because something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just remembering the woman who helped raise him. He was beginning to understand her sacrifice, and more than that, he was ready to do something about it. She had kept him warm through long winters of loneliness. Now he would return the warmth, and it wouldn't be just an act of kindness. It would be a promise to honor the quiet strength of the woman who never once asked to be remembered, but would never be forgotten again. The next morning, Keanu sent a simple text to Dolores. "Lunch, my treat, anywhere you'd like." She replied 3 hours later, right after finishing a shift at Mrs. McCormick's. "Okay, diner on St. Clair, after my shift at the Harris home, 2:15. Even in her reply, there was a rhythm of responsibility. She didn't cancel her commitments, she adjusted around them. Keanu arrived at the diner 15 minutes early. The place was small, the kind of place where the waitresses called everyone "hon," and the coffee refilled without asking. It smelled like bacon grease and maple syrup, like childhood weekends before everything got complicated. Dolores walked in right on time, wearing the same windbreaker, a bit of dust on her shoes. She looked tired, but she smiled when she saw him. "You beat me here," she said. He stood to greet her. "I was looking forward to this." They chose a corner booth. Dolores slid in with a sigh, easing the weight off her feet. "I don't usually sit this much during the day," she joked. "Feels like a luxury." He chuckled. "You've earned it 100 times over." They ordered modestly, grilled cheese for her, soup and salad for him. When the waitress left, Keanu leaned in a little closer. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said. She shook her head. "Wednesdays are light, just the Harrises in the morning. Mr. Harris has trouble with stairs. I do what I can." "You always do," Keanu said quietly. Dolores smiled, then grew still for a moment. Her eyes moved to the window, where pedestrians hurried by, jackets pulled tight against the chill. "You know," she began, "I used to think by this age I'd be somewhere warm, maybe living with Lucia and her kids, reading books, watering plants." She paused, then looked back at him. "But life's not a storybook. You take what you get and do the best with it." Keanu nodded, listening. "My husband, Hector, he passed away 21 years ago," she continued. "Stroke. Quick and sudden. One minute he was fixing the door hinge. Next, he was gone." "I'm so sorry," Keanu said gently. "We had plans," she said, "small ones, a little house near Lake Simcoe, a garden. But after he passed, it all stopped. Lucia was in high school. I had to keep going." Keanu stayed quiet. He knew there was more. "She went through a hard time, got in with the wrong people for a while, then she moved west. We still talk, but you know how it is." He didn't ask if she visited. The answer was already written in Dolores's eyes. She tries, she added. She has her own struggles, and I don't like to ask for too much. The food arrived, and Dolores immediately thanked the waitress by name. Keanu noticed how she took a moment to ask the woman how her mother was doing, something most people would skip. It was second nature for her, that kind of care. Dolores took a bite of her sandwich, then set it down with a napkin in her lap. "I've thought about retirement," she said, as if responding to an unspoken question. "Years ago, I even applied for senior housing, got on the list. But then the waiting got longer, and my rent went up. So I let it go." She didn't say it with bitterness, just fact. "It's not so bad," she continued. "I keep my mind busy, I like routines. My neighbors are kind, and work gives me a reason to move." Keanu stirred his soup. "But what about rest? What about the time to just breathe?" Dolores looked at him with a half smile. "Rest is for after the work's done." He shook his head slowly. "You've done more than your share." She took another bite and chewed thoughtfully. Then, almost to herself, she said, "It's funny. When you're young, you think the hardest part is making it through. But really, it's learning how to keep going when things don't turn out like you hoped." Keanu leaned back, struck by how calmly she said it. Not as a complaint, as a truth. "I was always good at getting by," she said. "That's a skill, you know. Some people think it means you've failed, but I think getting by is its own kind of strength." He watched her hands, still steady despite the work they had done that day. She moved with the care of someone used to keeping things from falling apart. She glanced up. "I'm sorry, Keanu. I didn't mean to dump all this on you." "You're not dumping anything," he said. "I asked. And I meant it." Dolores softened at his tone. "You were always different," she said. "Even when you were little, you noticed things. Not just what people said, but what they didn't say. That's why I knew you'd be okay." He wanted to respond, but his voice caught for a moment. Because sitting across from him was the woman who had done exactly that. Noticed what no one else did. Cared when no one else showed up. Stayed long after others walked away. And yet here she was, brushing off her own exhaustion like it was something she had to apologize for. He wasn't just shaken. He was quietly furious at the world that allowed someone like her to go unseen for so long. As the meal wound down, Dolores reached for her purse. "I'll get the tip," she said, half standing. Keanu gently placed his hand over hers. "No, please. Let me—" She looked at him for a second, as if weighing whether to insist. Then she nodded and sat back down, her posture still proud, but her shoulders settling just slightly. They walked out together into the late afternoon air. It had warmed a bit since morning, and sunlight broke through the thinning clouds. "I don't usually take this much time off in the middle of the day," she said with a light chuckle. "Feels like skipping school." Keanu smiled. "You deserve 10 lifetimes of this." She didn't answer right away. Then she said quietly, "We all do, but life doesn't hand it out evenly, does it?" They walked in silence for a few blocks, just enough to feel the rhythm of the city. She pointed out a shop that had once been a bakery and now sold cell phone accessories. He told her about a scene he once filmed near that corner. Their worlds had traveled different maps, but they overlapped in places that felt strangely familiar. When they reached the next intersection, she stopped. "I should get to the market before it closes, pick up some lentils and rice." He nodded. "Can I walk you there?" She waved him off. No. You've done more than enough. You have your own things to do." He hesitated. "Will you let me drive you home later?" She smiled. "I'll think about it." She turned to go, but then paused. "You've done well, Keanu, but more than that, you've stayed good." Her voice didn't tremble, but it stayed with him. He watched her walk away, her gait slow but sure, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who knew how to carry things, not just groceries or laundry, but people's burdens, memories. Years. and he realized something else. Dolores hadn't survived this long because life made it easy. She'd survived because she refused to let hardships steal her grace. She hadn't hardened, she hadn't grown bitter. She was still offering tamales, still asking how the waitress's mother was doing, still showing up to clean houses not because she had to, but because she didn't know any other way to serve. Behind her smile was 1,000 untold stories, but every one of them was stitched with dignity. Keanu stood on that street for a long time, and in his heart a quiet vow began to form. He wasn't just going to help her, he was going to honor her life. The flight back to Los Angeles was quiet, but Keanu's mind was not. He sat near the window, watching clouds drift by, his reflection faint in the glass. A week ago, he wouldn't have given the street outside that coffee shop a second glance. Now, every image in his head circled back to Dolores. Her hands, her voice, the way she spoke about life with grace carved from hardship. By the time the wheels touched down, the outline of an idea had already begun to form. Not a charity donation, not a one-time gesture, something else, something that lasted. He turned on his phone and sent a message to his team. "Don't schedule anything for me until further notice. Personal priority." The car picked him up, but he barely spoke. Once home, he walked through his front door and paused. Everything was clean, orderly, perfectly staged for comfort, but all he could think about was Dolores's apartment. The frayed cushions, the flickering lamp in the corner, the tea she served him with her best cup. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. No media, no noise, just research, quiet, deliberate work. First, her neighborhood. He located the address she had scribbled for him on a napkin at the diner. He traced the transit lines she took, the grocery stores nearby, the old churches still standing. Then, the building itself. A 6-unit walk-up near Lansdowne Avenue, built in the 1950s. Owned by a holding company out of Hamilton, rent-controlled. The reviews were mixed. Peeling paint, unreliable plumbing, but quiet neighbors and good light in the mornings. He called a contact in Toronto's housing office, someone he had helped fundraise with years ago. The favor was subtle. "I'm looking into a building for a friend. Can you tell me who handles maintenance and tenant services at 88 Glencairn?" The name came quickly, a man named Vernon, known for being courteous but hands-off, which in some ways was worse, neglect born of indifference. Keanu wrote down the name and moved on. Next, her employers. Mrs. McCormick, the Harris family, a few others she had mentioned in passing. He searched for their names in local business directories, property records, Facebook groups. Every detail helped. Then he began making quiet calls, nothing dramatic, just questions. Does she ever take days off? Has anyone offered her transportation? Do you know if she's ever mentioned needing assistance? Most of the answers were what he feared. "She's proud," one said. "Won't let anyone help too much. He's always first to arrive. She refuses to raise her rate." He closed his notebook and sat in stillness for a moment. He couldn't fix everything, but he could start somewhere, and he would do it quietly, the way she had always done for him. Keanu reached out to his financial advisor the next day, asking for a meeting that would stay completely off the books. "I need to set up something private," he said. "No publicity, no press, not even tied to my name if it can be helped." The advisor hesitated. "Of course, what kind of setup are we talking about?" "A foundation," Keanu replied. "Small, quiet. For now it has only one purpose." He didn't name Dolores, but the intent was unmistakable. He wanted to create something sustainable, a structure that wouldn't just offer help, but dignity. That wouldn't embarrass someone like her with handouts, but instead open doors she had quietly locked herself out of. He named it the Second Light Fund. It sounded like what she had been to him, a second light in a childhood that sometimes felt dim. Next, he hired a discreet team in Toronto, not lawyers or agents. but listeners. People who could speak to tenants, check on housing conditions, get a feel for what was really happening inside the buildings Dolores cleaned, and more importantly, how to improve her life without disrupting her pride. Get her boiler checked, he said. Upgrade the heating system in the unit, but make it look like routine work. Put in a request for new stairs and handrails. Say it's a city safety inspection. Send groceries to the complex twice a month, anonymous donations through the local food co-op, nothing flashy. He was designing a blueprint not for charity, but for quiet restoration, a kind of justice only the overlooked would understand. He also arranged to have her paid cleaning rates reviewed. Several of the families she worked for had the means to do better. They simply hadn't thought to question it. He didn't force their hands, he gave them perspective. Do you know she worked 3 hours past schedule last month because your mother's oxygen machine wasn't working? She stayed with her until the nurse arrived. That conversation shifted the tone. They agreed to raise her rate, without Dolores ever needing to ask. He kept a journal during this time, noting every small action taken on her behalf. At the top of every page he wrote the same line. She gave without expectation. I will give with purpose. But through it all, he didn't call her. Not yet. He wanted to show up again, not with sympathy, but with a solution, something she wouldn't have to feel guilty for accepting, something that felt like dignity, not debt. And so the plan grew, one detail at a time. Quiet, focused, just like she had taught him. 2 weeks later, Keanu stood in a small architectural office in Silver Lake, studying blueprints on a large wooden table. The space wasn't for a mansion or a film set, it was for something smaller, more meaningful. He had purchased a quiet plot of land just outside Toronto, not far from where Dolores used to take him on walks as a child. It was tucked away, surrounded by trees, and bordered by a small creek that ran clear in the spring. The plan was simple: a one-story home with wide hallways, natural light, and a porch that faced the rising sun. There would be a garden in the back, fully accessible, raised beds so she could tend to flowers without bending too much, a reading nook inside, hardwood floors she wouldn't have to mop, a guest room in case Lucia ever visited. Everything practical, humble, and full of care. She'll never accept it if she thinks it's a gift, Keanu told the architect. So I want it registered under a senior housing trust. Let her pay something small, whatever makes it feel fair. But don't tie it to my name. They nodded, understanding the heart behind the request. Next came the furnishings. No luxury, just warmth. Things that felt like memory, not money. A quilt for the bed. A kettle that whistled. Curtains in soft colors. Every detail mattered. He flew to Toronto quietly once construction began. No press, no entourage. Just him in a coat and scarf, checking on the site like a man inspecting something personal, which, in every way, it was. Meanwhile, the Second Light Fund continued its work behind the scenes. With Keanu's quiet donations, 3 more seniors in Dolores' neighborhood received upgraded heaters and home safety evaluations. A small mobile healthcare unit began making monthly visits. A new bench was installed at the bus stop she used most, shaded from wind and rain. And still Dolores didn't know. She went about her days as she always had, clocking in, checking lists, folding linens with care. She thought her improved stairwell was a lucky city upgrade. She didn't notice the rent hadn't increased. She didn't question why the grocery bags on her doorstep had her favorite brand of tea inside. It was all working. Quietly, respectfully, and still Keanu hadn't called her again. Because the time wasn't right, not yet. He wanted her to experience the first fruits of what she'd planted, long before he ever said a word. Not because she needed to know it was him, but because she deserved to feel, finally, that the world hadn't forgotten her. That someone had been watching all along, and was finally quietly repaying a lifetime of invisible love. The morning started before the sky turned blue. Dolores Alvarez stirred awake at 5:12 a.m. sharp, not because of an alarm, but because that's when her body always woke her. Years of rhythm couldn't be undone. She sat at the edge of her bed, stretched her back gently, and murmured a quiet prayer in Spanish before slipping on her house shoes. She boiled water for tea in the small kitchen, careful not to wake her neighbors. She didn't know it, but her electricity bill had been quietly reduced by a community energy subsidy Keanu had arranged weeks earlier. She only noticed it was lower and chalked it up to using fewer lights. Her breakfast was simple, half a banana and a slice of toast with butter. She wrapped another piece of bread in foil and tucked it in her coat pocket. Not for her, but for something else. At 6:01 a.m., she stepped outside into the cold, buttoning her jacket as the wind met her face. She walked 2 blocks to the bus stop and sat on the new bench that had mysteriously appeared last month. She didn't know who installed it, but she was grateful. Her knees no longer ached, waiting on the bare concrete. The first bus came at 6:18. She greeted the driver with a "Good morning, mijo," as she always did, and sat in her usual spot, 3rd row from the front on the left. The ride took her through downtown, past the bakery she used to visit with Hector on Sundays, and past the church she hadn't been to since Lucia moved west. Her first stop was the Maxwell home, where she cleaned every Tuesday and Friday. The Maxwells were always kind but busy. Dolores let herself in with the spare key, removed her shoes, and started with the kitchen. She scrubbed the sink, wiped every counter, and refolded the towels hanging on the oven door, just because it looked neater that way. In the nursery, she picked up a rattle the baby had dropped and placed it back in the crib. She dusted the windowsills, swept the floors, and left a note on the kitchen counter, letting the Maxwells know the back door lock was sticking again. She was gone by 8:15. Outside, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the wrapped slice of bread. Behind the alley near the park, a stray tabby cat waited by the dumpster. Dolores crouched, her knees protesting, and gently placed the bread near a paper napkin she'd folded into a dish. "There you go, Keanu," she whispered. "Still warm." She didn't pet the cat. It didn't trust humans. But it came every day, and so did she. At 8:30 a.m., she arrived at her second job, a tall brownstone with ivy curling around the side like green veins. The Harris family had lived there for over a decade. Mr. Harris was recovering from surgery, and his wife taught piano from the front parlor. Dolores knocked once, then let herself in gently. She always started with the linens. The washing machine rattled unevenly, but she knew how to wedge the broom handle behind it to keep it balanced. She folded sheets warm and tight, the way her mother had taught her back in Mexico City, before they ever dreamed of Canada. In the bathroom, she used vinegar instead of bleach. It was kinder to the lungs. The Harris's youngest had asthma, and Dolores had noticed the coughing get worse after harsh chemicals. No one had asked her to change products. She had just noticed. By 10:45, she was steaming curtains in the sitting room. She paused once to catch her breath and sat on the windowsill for a moment. Her eyes caught the sunlight filtering through the sheer fabric. For that single minute, she let her mind drift back to the garden Hector had promised to build, back to Lucia's first piano recital, back to the scent of rosewater soap from the home she used to clean on Avenue Road. Then the phone buzzed, a reminder from the grocery co-op. Her weekly bundle would be ready at noon. Dolores packed her bag and left the Harris home just before 11:15, stopping only to check the stairs railing that had recently been fixed. She had mentioned it to the city inspector months ago, but assumed they had finally followed through. She caught her second bus and transferred at College Street. At the co-op, the clerk handed her a bag already prepared: lentils, oranges, whole grain bread, and a box of her favorite tea. She blinked at the list. "I didn't request oranges," she said. The clerk smiled. "Sometimes we add extras." Dolores nodded. "Tell your manager thank you. It's very kind." At home, she had 30 minutes to rest before heading to her final job. She set the groceries down on the table, boiled water for a new cup of tea, and sat with her feet propped on a footstool she'd found at a garage sale 2 years ago. Outside her window, a child's voice rang out in Spanish. She smiled to herself and leaned back. Just for a moment. What she didn't know was that someone across the street had been watching her day, not in malice, but with reverence. One of Keanu's assistants, a quiet man with a camera and a notebook, had followed her respectful distance since morning, not to record footage for fame, not for exposure, but to understand, to see what Keanu felt the world had missed. At 2:00 p.m., Dolores made her way to her final job of the day. It was a smaller home belonging to an elderly woman named Mrs. Rosen, who had recently fractured her hip. The job wasn't about cleaning. It was companionship, disguised as light chores. Dolores brought soup in a thermos and a small packet of sweet biscuits she had saved from the co-op bundle. Mrs. Rosen smiled when she entered. "I was hoping you'd come." "I always do," Dolores replied softly. She helped the woman sit comfortably, tidied the kitchen, and replaced the flowers in a chipped vase with fresh ones from the corner store. When Dolores finally sat, Mrs. Rosen took her hand. "You're the only person I trust to say how I really feel." Dolores didn't respond with advice. She simply listened, and sometimes that was more than enough. By 4:30 p.m. she was back on the bus, this time with a slight lean in her shoulders, the fatigue finally creeping in. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, her face turned toward the window, watching a city pass that rarely paused to see her. Back at her apartment, she hung up her coat, reheated some rice, and sat with the radio on low. There was a call-in program about local history. She smiled when a caller mentioned an old candy shop that used to stand on Queen Street. She remembered buying 2 peppermints for a nickel there, one for her, one for little Keanu. When the clock struck 7:00, she did her evening stretches, slow and careful. Her knees protested again. She pressed on. Then, before heading to bed, she stepped outside with the remaining crumbs from dinner. The tabby cat was waiting. "Still here, Carino," she whispered. She bent slowly, poured the crumbs into the dish, and sat beside the wall for a few minutes while the cat ate. In the distance, headlights passed. And in one of those cars, parked just around the corner, was the assistant again, jotting down every gesture. Not for surveillance, not to interfere, but because Keanu wanted every detail right, every part of her life preserved, not in camera footage, but in human memory. He wanted to build something that honored the way she lived, not what she lacked, not her poverty, but her power, her grace, her tireless dignity. When Dolores finally returned inside and turned out the light, the world outside went on as usual. But for those who had finally begun to see her, the quiet of her apartment wasn't empty. It was full of the kind of strength few people ever noticed. And the plan Keanu had begun in silence continued to grow. The afternoon light filtered softly through the leaves as Keanu stood in front of the old house on Hazelton Avenue. It looked smaller than he remembered. The paint had faded, and the hedges that once stood neat and trimmed now sagged with age. But the bones of the place were still there, just like the memories. He hadn't been back in decades. Life had moved on. So had his family. But the moment he stepped onto the cracked walkway, something in his chest stirred. The sound of his childhood echoed faintly in the creak of the porch, in the scent of old maple trees nearby. He knocked on the door of the neighboring house, the one where Mrs. Goldstein used to live. A woman in her 70s answered, her gray hair pulled back in a tidy bun. Her eyes widened. "Oh my goodness, Keanu?" He smiled. "Hi, Mrs. Levine." She gasped. "I haven't seen you since, Lord, since your mother's second wedding, I think." He nodded. "It's been a long time." She stepped aside. Come in, come in." The inside of the house hadn't changed much. Same floral wallpaper, same wooden clock ticking in the hallway. She led him to the kitchen, where the kettle was already warm. "I heard you were in town," she said, "but I figured it was just rumors. You always kept quiet." Keanu glanced out the window toward the house next door. "I came back for someone." Mrs. Levine followed his gaze and smiled knowingly. "Dolores." He nodded. "I'm still working, you know," Mrs. Levine said, pouring the tea. "Unbelievable woman, doesn't know how to rest." "I saw her," Keanu said softly. "She hasn't changed." Mrs. Levine sat down across from him. "She was more than a housekeeper, Keanu. You know that." "I'm starting to realize just how much more." Mrs. Levine stirred her tea, then looked up. "You were just a boy, but Dolores, she was everyone's safety net on that street. When my Leo got laid off, she brought us food from her own fridge. When the Ayub family lost their baby to fever, she came every day for a week to help clean and cook." Keanu listened in silence. "There was a time," Mrs. Levine continued, "when the woman in Unit 4, Maria, I think, couldn't afford a doctor for her son. He had a terrible cough. Dolores found an old friend who worked at the hospital, got the boy seen, medicine delivered, never told a soul." Keanu leaned back in his chair, stunned. "She never told us any of that." Mrs. Levine laughed gently. "Of course not. She never did it for recognition. She just saw what needed doing and did it." The kettle hissed gently behind them. Keanu stared into his tea, the steam rising like memory from a past he thought he understood. Mrs. Levine stood and returned with an old photo album wrapped in a faded cloth. She set it gently on the table and opened it. "He's in a few of these," she said. "Back when we used to do block parties and potlucks, before everyone moved away or forgot how to be neighbors." Keanu leaned closer. There she was. Dolores, in her 30s, holding a tray of tamales with flour dusted across her cheek. Another picture showed her comforting a crying child on a front porch, arms wrapped around him like he was her own. In the corner of one photo, a younger Keanu sat on the curb with a paper plate in his lap, while Dolores looked on, smiling in the background. She always made sure the kids had seconds before she took anything for herself, Mrs. Levine said, even when it was her food on the table. Keanu smiled softly. "She raised me when no one else had time." "He raised a lot of us," Mrs. Levine replied. "You remember Mr. Jenkins, the man with the cane who used to yell at everybody?" He nodded. "He cooked for him every Thursday. He used to complain about her tamales, said they were too spicy, but he ate every bite." Keanu laughed. "She took in a stray dog once," Mrs. Levine added. "It had been hit by a car. No one else would go near it. She sat with it on her porch for 3 days, cleaning its wounds, feeding it chicken broth. When it recovered, it followed her everywhere like a shadow." There was silence for a while. Then Keanu spoke. "I used to think of her as just a kind woman who helped around the house. I didn't see the rest." "Most people didn't," she said, "because she never asked to be seen, but now, maybe it's time she is." He closed the album and placed his hand on the cover. "I'm trying to figure out how." Mrs. Levine studied him. "You don't need a grand gesture, Keanu. She never wanted parades. She just wanted people to treat each other with kindness, to be seen, to matter." He nodded slowly. "I'm building something for her, a home, a way to let her rest, but I think it has to be more." Mrs. Levine smiled. "Then make it about what she gave, not just what she missed." The words stayed with him. He stood, thanked her, and gave her a warm hug before leaving. Outside, the sky had darkened slightly, but his path had never been clearer. He wasn't just honoring a housekeeper, he was honoring a builder of lives, a quiet architect of resilience and grace. Before heading back to his hotel, Keanu made one last stop. He walked around the back of his old childhood home, now rented to another family. The garage door was different, painted blue instead of white, but the concrete step out back was still the same. He stood there for a long moment. letting the wind stir up the scent of dry leaves and distant city traffic. He remembered sitting on that step with scraped knees and a paper towel full of orange slices Dolores had cut for him. He remembered her singing softly in Spanish, her voice always steady, like the ground beneath his feet. That memory wasn't something extraordinary, it wasn't dramatic, but it had stayed with him all these years. Not every legacy comes from loud moments. Some come from showing up every single day, without praise, without rest, without ever needing to be thanked. As he turned to leave, a thought settled in his chest like a quiet drumbeat. He had to find a way for others to know her, not through a viral moment or a headline, but through something lasting. He called his assistant that evening. "I want to expand the Second Light Fund," he said. "I wanted to recognize the invisible people, people like Dolores, caregivers, immigrants, quiet workers who shaped lives while no one noticed." His assistant was quiet on the other end. Then, "What should we call it?" Keanu paused. "Call it the Dolores Initiative." He outlined the details: scholarships for children of domestic workers, wellness grants for senior caregivers, and spotlight programs to document unsung community heroes. And it would start with one name. Her name. Back in Toronto, Dolores ended her day the same way she always did, washing her dishes slowly, turning off the lights, and sitting for a moment by the window before heading to bed. She didn't know that somewhere people were beginning to learn her story. Not just the story of what she did in Keanu's home, but who she was to a whole neighborhood. A quiet shield, a helper, a second light. She didn't know that in a few short weeks, her life would change forever. Not because of pity, but because someone finally saw everything she had been. Keanu looked out the window of his hotel room that night and felt something shift in his heart. This wasn't about paying her back. There was no way to measure what she had given. But maybe, just maybe, it was about making sure the world remembered what it often overlooked. Not just a woman with a mop and a kind smile, but a legacy, wrapped in patience, but one quiet, beautiful day at a time. The cold had started to ease in Toronto. The park where Dolores often sat was quiet that morning, the wind crisp but the sun warming the benches. She carried a small bag of breadcrumbs in her hand and moved slowly toward her usual spot, the third bench from the end, beneath a birch tree that had once been struck by lightning but continued to grow. The birds recognized her before she sat. A cluster of sparrows and one bold pigeon gathered at her feet. She smiled and lowered herself carefully onto the bench. Her joints ached more lately, but she never missed these mornings. It was her 1 hour of silence before the noise of the world took over. She hadn't noticed him approach, not at first, but she felt a shadow shift slightly in the light and looked up to see Keanu standing beside the bench, holding 2 cups of coffee. She blinked, caught between memory and present. "You came back," she said softly. "I had to." He handed her a cup. She accepted it with a smile and held it in both hands, warming her fingers. "You remembered I like milk but no sugar." He nodded. "Some things don't fade." They sat for a moment, watching the birds hop along the sidewalk. "I've been thinking about you," he said. She chuckled. "I'm not that interesting, Keanu." He turned slightly toward her. "You're more than you know." Dolores glanced at him with warmth but also weariness. "I've lived a simple life. I just did what I could." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it so extraordinary." A gust of wind passed through the trees. Dolores tucked her scarf closer to her neck. "I came to ask you something," Keanu said. She looked over, her hand still wrapped around the cup. He hesitated for a breath, then continued. "I want to pay off your debts. Whatever's left, rent, medical bills, anything. And I've found a place. A warm apartment, closer to the gardens. Safe, quiet, yours." Dolores blinked once, twice. She didn't speak right away. "Keanu," she began, but her voice caught. "You don't owe me anything," she said gently. "I know," he said, "but that's not why I'm doing it." She stared at the ground. "You've already given me so much just by remembering." He shook his head. "This is just the beginning. You spent your whole life helping others. Let someone help you now." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had never been one to cry in public. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "I'm sure," he said. Dolores didn't nod. She didn't smile right away. She simply sat, still and quiet, as if weighing not the offer, but whether she had earned it. The birds continued to peck at the crumbs near her feet, unaware that something enormous was unfolding in the hush of the morning. Dolores stared straight ahead, her lips pressed together in thought. Keanu didn't rush her. He knew her silence wasn't resistance, it was reverence. She was thinking through the lives she'd supported, the debts she'd hidden, the dignity she'd guarded for decades. "I still work 3 days a week," she finally said. "There's an older woman in the annex. She needs someone to help her dress, cook a few meals. If I leave, she has no one." "We can take care of her," Keanu said. "I'll make sure she has support. You don't have to carry everything anymore." Dolores let out a quiet breath. "It's strange," she said. "When you're needed for so long, it becomes your identity. When the need is gone, who are you?" "You're still you," Keanu said. "You're the woman who raised me, who held a community together. That doesn't disappear because you finally sit down." Dolores looked at him then, her eyes watery but clear. "You were so small," she whispered, "when your father left. You used to sit under the kitchen table and draw in silence. You didn't cry, but your eyes always searched the room." "I remember," Keanu said. "You used to call me Mamita," she said, a soft smile forming. "I still do. In here," he said, gently tapping his chest. That did it. She turned away for a second, swiping at a tear before it had the chance to fall. "I've a few things in that apartment I've lived with for 30 years, she said. "Old pots, a wooden spoon I brought from Mexico. I want to keep them, even if they're worn." "You'll keep everything you want," Keanu said, "and more. There's no rush." She finally looked back at him and gave a slow nod. "I'll come," she said, "but only if you promise me something. Anything. No interviews, no newspapers, no story on television." He smiled. "Of course not. I want to end my life the way I lived it. Quiet, gentle, without spectacle." "You have my word," he said. She reached into the paper bag and threw a few more crumbs for the birds, which fluttered and flapped excitedly. Then she added softly, "But maybe just once. Just once. It feels nice to be seen." Keanu didn't reply. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. He saw her, not just as someone from his past, but as a presence that shaped the man he became. They sat a while longer, letting the breeze move around them, letting the moment settle. In a world that often shouts, some promises are made in silence, and kept just the same. The next day, Keanu returned, not alone, but with a quiet, efficient team who had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. No photographers, no flashing lights, just warmth, respect, and careful attention to detail. Dolores met them at her apartment door, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. "I hope it's not too messy," she said with a shy laugh. Inside, the apartment was spotless, worn but dignified. Photos of her late husband on the wall, a small crucifix above the kitchen door. Her wooden spoon, smooth from years of stirring, hung from a hook by the stove. One of Keanu's team members handed her a folder, gently. Inside were the finalized documents, the debt payments confirmed, her new lease signed, the moving schedule outlined but flexible. "There's no rush," Keanu said again. "Everything happens at your pace." Dolores sat down on the edge of her couch, staring at the paperwork. It felt unreal, like waking into someone else's dream. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You already said yes," Keanu replied. She turned her eyes toward the window. "I used to wonder if anyone noticed. All those years, you think you'd disappear. Then someone shows up and tells you, you were never invisible." He sat beside her. "You weren't, not to me." They walked through her apartment, room by room. Keanu listened to every story behind each item she chose to take. A shawl her mother had woven, a chipped cup from her wedding, a small glass angel, she said, had kept her safe. She packed lightly. Dolores didn't want much, but she wanted those few things wrapped with care, not because of their value, but because they had held her life inside them. By the following weekend, they moved her into her new place. A second-story walk-up with an elevator, wide windows, and a small balcony that overlooked a garden she could visit every morning. The kitchen had new appliances, but they made space for her wooden spoon right above the stove. She cried when she saw it hanging there, like nothing about her life had been left behind. And when she stepped into the bedroom, there on the nightstand was a framed photo. Her and Keanu when he was small, a drawing clutched in his hands, her arm around his shoulder. She touched the frame gently. Later that evening, as the sun poured gold across the room, she sat on her new balcony in a soft armchair and watched the wind ripple through the garden trees. Her hands rested still in her lap. For the first time in years, she didn't have to get up early. For the first time in decades, she had space to simply breathe. And in that silence, filled with the echoes of a life well lived, she knew she had not been forgotten. The senior apartment had large windows that bathed the living space in light, soft beige walls framed with calm watercolors, and a gentle from the hall that never felt intrusive. It wasn't a facility, it was a home. That was the first thing Dolores said when she stepped through the door on her first official morning. "I didn't know places like this existed," she whispered as she walked slowly across the living room, the soft carpet cushioning each step. The apartment came furnished, but they'd made room for her shawl on the chair, her wooden spoon in the kitchen, and her photo with Keanu on the nightstand. Her few things had been placed with great care, not to fill space, but to remind her this place belonged to her. The staff greeted her with genuine smiles. A woman named Maya, the resident wellness coordinator, introduced herself first. "If you ever want company during meals or someone to walk the garden with, I'm around most days." Dolores smiled but stayed quiet. She wasn't used to being offered company, at least not just for her own sake. By the end of the week, she knew the names of the cooks, the night nurse, and the gardener. Not because they introduced themselves, but because she asked. Because she always had. She treated them not like people there to serve her, but as equals. Keanu visited the second day she moved in, carrying a paper bag from a small shop he remembered she liked. Inside were 2 tins of loose-leaf tea and a worn copy of a book she'd once mentioned decades ago, Like Water for Chocolate. Dolores gasped softly when she saw the title. "I read this in Spanish when my daughter was a baby," she said, running her fingers along the cover. "But I've never read it in English." "Well," Keanu said, sitting beside her near the balcony, "then it's about time." They drank tea together in the quiet. No interviews, no cameras, just time. That became a routine. Once or twice a week, he'd stop by. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat. Sometimes they read aloud. Over time, the staff began to notice how people in the building paused when she entered a room, not because she was famous, but because she radiated a calm, a dignity that felt rare. One afternoon, Maya found her sitting in the community art room, staring at a blank canvas. "Ever painted before?" Maya asked. Dolores nodded slowly. "Once. A long time ago, before my hands got so busy with laundry and dishes and raising other people's babies." Maya handed her a brush and smiled. "Then maybe it's time to remember what your hands were made for." Dolores stared at the brush, then at her fingers. They trembled slightly, but they remembered. The brush felt heavier than she remembered, but there was something comforting in its weight. Dolores dipped it slowly into a soft shade of blue. She hadn't thought about what to paint, she just let the color guide her. Her first stroke was shaky, the second more certain. By the third, the lines curved like old rivers rediscovered. Maya sat nearby, pretending to read but sneaking glances now and then. She didn't interrupt. She simply let Dolores move through her memories at her own pace. By the end of the hour, the canvas held the early shape of a kitchen window. Not just any window, her window. From the house where she had spent 3 decades watching children grow, steam rise, and seasons pass. The next day, she came back. This time with a small towel to cover her lap and a thermos of tea. The painting grew. A curtain appeared, pale yellow with fading sun, a pot on the stove. A small boy sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketched lightly, almost not there, but unmistakably Keanu. Word of her work spread quietly. One of the other residents, a retired school teacher, asked if she could sit in the corner and watch. Another asked to join, setting up an easel beside her with uncertain hands. Dolores welcomed them all with the same warmth she'd once offered to every child who had ever felt forgotten in the homes she cleaned. Keanu returned that week and found her in the middle of the community art room, surrounded by color, conversation, and the quiet sound of lives being gently restored. He smiled and didn't interrupt. Later, they sat on her balcony again. She poured him tea with her usual precision. "I think I forgot how to do something for myself," she said, her voice low. "But you didn't forget how to give," Keanu replied. She nodded. "It's hard to believe I have this now. You earned this 1,000 times over." She looked out at the garden. The light was gold again, the same hue as the brushstroke she had used to paint the afternoon sun through her kitchen window. "I don't need much," she said. "But I needed this. A space, a little peace, a way to remember who I was before life asked me to give it all away." Keanu nodded. "And who you are now." Dolores didn't speak after that. She just smiled and poured another cup of tea, the steam curling between them like threads stitched gently back together. In the silence, healing didn't demand attention. It simply happened. By the end of her first month in the new apartment, Dolores had completed 3 paintings. Each one carried something deeply personal. Her mother's face, remembered from an old photograph, the silhouette of her late husband beside their small wedding altar, and that first window, now finished in full afternoon light. They weren't polished in the way gallery paintings might be, but they were honest. They held emotion in every stroke, in every careful patch of color. When staff and residents saw them, they didn't comment on technique, they felt them. They saw memory alive in brushwork. One morning, Keanu brought in a simple wooden frame. "For this one," he said, holding up the painting of the kitchen window. Dolores touched the canvas and smiled. "Then it will finally have a home." They hung it above her reading chair in the corner of the living room. She didn't say much about it afterward. But often, when visitors came, they'd find her sitting near it, gazing at it, like one might gaze at an old friend. Word eventually reached a small local gallery. Maya, with Dolores's quiet permission, submitted a photograph of the painting for their annual community showcase. It was accepted. The gallery owner wrote a short description to accompany the piece. By Anonymous, a painting of survival, memory, and gentleness in motion. Created by hands that worked for others, now working for their own healing. Dolores didn't attend the opening, but she received a photo of her work on display. When she opened the envelope and saw it, she didn't speak for a full minute. Then she folded the image carefully, tucked it into her Bible, and said, "That's enough." Keanu visited later that week, sitting with her as she brewed cinnamon tea. "Dobie, put your painting up." "I know," she said with a proud smile. "I'm still not famous, but now I'm visible." He nodded. Dolores leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "I don't need more," she said. "I've been given so much. Not just the home or the help, but the chance to return to something I forgot I loved. That's the real gift." Keanu looked at her gently. "That's why we called it the Dolores Initiative. Because it's not just about helping people. It's about reminding them that who they are matters." Outside, the garden trees swayed. Inside, the woman who had once walked quietly through other people's homes now walked through her own. With light in her steps, color in her hands, and dignity resting on her shoulders like a shawl. Her place was no longer borrowed. It was her own. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that made everything outside blur into soft watercolor. Keanu had come by with a box of herbal teas and a new sketchbook for Dolores. They'd started trading small gifts like that. Nothing extravagant, just gestures, pieces of thought passed back and forth. Dolores wasn't in the living room when he arrived. He called out lightly, and she answered from the bedroom. "I'm just putting things away, come on in." He stepped inside, careful not to track rain from his shoes. Her room smelled faintly of lavender and dry cedar wood, a scent she said reminded her of the village where she was born. She was kneeling beside the bed, adjusting a small chest she kept tucked beneath it. He reached to help her slide it out. "You don't have to," she began. But he was already crouching down, pulling the container into the light. The lid was old, the edges soft from years of touch. As he opened it, expecting to find blankets or maybe keepsakes, he paused. Inside were dozens of rolled papers and canvases, stacks of them, some wrapped in soft fabric, others bare. He looked up. "Dolores, what is all this?" She looked embarrassed for a second. Then she gave a small shrug. "Just old drawings. I used to paint, back when I had time and silence." Keanu reached in gently and pulled one free. The edges of the canvas were curled slightly inward from age. He unrolled it slowly, revealing a street scene. Toronto in winter, the snow piled on rooftops, a small boy walking beside a woman in a green coat. Her face turned toward him. He recognized the street. This wasn't just any painting, it was their block. He pulled out another, a portrait of a girl in pigtails, laughing in front of a rusted gate. A third, an older man on a bus, asleep beneath a streetlight. Everyday life, captured with care. And then, the one that made him pause completely. A sketch. Charcoal on faded parchment. It was him. A teenage boy, thin and wide-eyed, sitting by a window with a book in his lap. The light from the window poured across his shoulder, and the way it was drawn. It wasn't just memory, it was love. Tenderness in every line. Keanu couldn't speak. Dolores watched his face. "I used to draw after you went to bed," she said, voice low. "After I'd cleaned the kitchen. After I'd checked on your mother. When the house was finally quiet. I'd sit at the corner of the kitchen table with whatever paper I could find." She touched the edge of the canvas. "It made me feel like I still existed." He looked at her, stunned. "You never stopped existing," he said. "Not for a second." Dolores chuckled softly, but her eyes were glassy. "I didn't mean it in a sad way," she said. "Back then, I didn't need anyone to know. I wasn't trying to be an artist. I just needed to remember I was more than a uniform, that I had thoughts, colors inside me, that I saw things." Keanu gently laid the sketch of himself beside the others and picked up a painting wrapped in a piece of cloth that looked like an old apron. He unwrapped it to reveal a scene of the harbor from a high angle. Boats frozen mid-drift, the sky painted in thick strokes of gray and rose. It looked like dawn, the time of day most people slept through, but she had been awake, working, watching. "These are incredible," he said, still stunned. "Why didn't you ever show them to anyone?" She gave a tired shrug. "Who would have cared? I was a housekeeper. My work wasn't supposed to be seen. It was supposed to disappear before the morning came." Keanu stared at her. The quiet in his chest wasn't empty. It was filled with reverence, awe. "You weren't just cleaning a house," he said. "You were building memory." Dolores smiled. "You always did talk like a poet." He smiled back, then carefully stacked the paintings to one side. "Would you mind if I photographed a few of these, just to keep them safe, in case anything ever happened?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I trust you. But don't make a fuss." "No fuss," he promised. "Just light and honesty." Later that evening, he sat with her while she talked about the first time she ever painted. She'd been 10, in the hills outside Puebla, drawing with crushed berries and bits of charcoal. Her school had no supplies, so her mother stitched a sketchbook out of old receipts and sewing patterns. "I drew everything," she said. "Goats, stones, my brother climbing trees. I used to hide under the stairs and draw people's shoes." "Why shoes?" "Because they always told a story. If they were polished, they belonged to a man with pride. If they were torn, someone who worked hard. If they were missing laces, maybe a mother with too many children." Keanu laughed gently. "You saw the world in such detail." "I had to. When no one sees you, you learn to see everything." He sat with that. Not every artist wants to be known. Some just want to know themselves. And Dolores, for all her years in quiet rooms, had never let the world take her vision. It had simply waited, patiently, until someone she once loved found it again, hidden under a bed, wrapped in time and grace. The next morning, Keanu returned with a small tripod and a soft light panel. He didn't bring a crew, just himself, dressed casually, camera in hand. Dolores watched him set up with amused patience. "You look like one of those fancy catalog photographers," she teased. "I wish I were that good," he replied. "I just want to make sure your work is preserved." He handled each canvas with quiet reverence. One by one, he captured the strokes, the faded edges, even the tiny thumbprint smudges in the corners. He took notes on the backs, marking dates where he could, listening as she offered details. "That one was during the blackout in '77. I painted this one when your sister cried herself to sleep, and I didn't want to forget the shape of her face in the dark." Each painting held a story, and for the first time, those stories were being heard. At the end of the session, Keanu carefully rolled the canvases back into their cloth wrappings, returning them to her care. "You know," he said, glancing toward the bedroom window where sunlight filtered in, "I think these deserve to be seen." Dolores shook her head. "I'm too old for that." "You're not too old to be remembered," he said. "And your work is part of history." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him, her eyes steady. "If people see these, I don't want them to see me as some charity case. I don't want pity." "Lee won't," Keanu said. "They'll see strength. They'll see beauty that survived in silence." He didn't push her. But later that week, when Maya asked if Dolores would consider contributing a few more pieces to the community gallery wall, Dolores said yes, not out of obligation, but because, deep down, she knew it was time. They selected 3 works: the Toronto street in winter, the harbor at dawn, and the sketch of Keanu reading by the window, his face caught in that soft moment between pages and dreams. When the pieces were hung, no plaque mentioned Keanu Reeves, no publicity, just a small name card. Artist, Dolores Alvarez. Residents stopped and stared. Some asked questions. One woman, in tears, told Dolores the harbor painting reminded her of the view her mother once described from the ship that brought her to. Dolores simply nodded and said, "That's why we paint, to give memories a place to rest." Keanu stood beside her during the small unveiling. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. This wasn't about him. Never had been. It was about the woman who once painted in silence so she could remember who she was. And now, finally, the world was remembering her too. It started with a quiet phone call. Keanu reached out to a modest gallery tucked between a bookstore and a bakery on the east side of Toronto. The gallery specialized in community exhibitions, often featuring unknown artists with powerful, lived stories behind their work. When he explained who Dolores was and what she had painted in secret for decades, the curator didn't hesitate. "She's exactly who we're here for," the woman said. "People like her are the soul of this city." Over the next 2 weeks, Keanu worked with Maya and a small, trusted team to prepare the exhibit. He gave it a name that Dolores would never have chosen for herself. The Housekeeper's Eye. He wanted people to understand that her role in life had never limited her view. If anything, it had deepened it. Her art wasn't separate from her service. It had grown out of it, like wildflowers rising between the cracks of forgotten sidewalks. He selected 15 pieces. The harbor at dawn, the sketch of him reading, the girl with the pigtails, shoes, doors, windows, and light. Always light. The framing was simple, the space clean, no bold banners, just soft lighting, quiet music, and handwritten quotes from her journals and old notes he'd encouraged her to dictate. The opening was set for a Thursday afternoon. The invitation list was kept small to honor Dolores's shy spirit. Residents from the senior home, a few gallery supporters, and some of the people whose lives had been quietly reflected in her paintings, even if they hadn't realized it until now. But Dolores didn't know any of this. Keanu told her they were going to lunch. He picked her up in his usual way, gently, warmly, with 2 cups of tea waiting in the car. She wore her best coat, buttoned all the way to the top, and a scarf he had given her during the colder weeks. "You're being very mysterious today," she said, glancing at him. He just smiled. "You'll see." They drove through neighborhoods filled with red brick and snow-softened sidewalks. As they neared the gallery, Keanu asked the driver to slow. "Wait here just a second," he said, stepping out and walking around to open her door himself. "Now I'm suspicious," she said, but took his hand anyway. When they stepped inside, the light caught her first. Then the silence. Then the paintings. Her paintings, covering the walls. Framed, hung, labeled with her name. She stopped walking. For a moment, her hand tightened around Keanu's arm. She didn't speak. People in the room turned. Conversations paused. One of the guests whispered, "That's her." And then, applause. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, it was gentle. And it broke her. Tears slipped down Dolores's cheeks before she even realized she was crying. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her hands hovered near her chest, unsure whether to cover her mouth or reach for someone to hold onto. Keanu gently offered his arm again. She leaned on it, not for support. She didn't stumble, but something in her legs had gone quiet, like her body needed to pause, to let her heart catch up. "You did this," she whispered. "Why?" "Because you saw all of us," Keanu replied. "Now it's your turn to be seen." A woman approached, her eyes shining with admiration. She introduced herself as Claire, a writer who had grown up in one of the neighborhoods Dolores had painted. "That sketch?" Claire said, pointing toward the piece of a boy and his mother waiting for a bus under a flickering street lamp. "That was us. I didn't know it until now. But that was my childhood." Dolores blinked at her. "You remember it." "I never forgot it. I just didn't know someone else had seen us." Others followed. A young man recognized the park where he used to feed pigeons with his grandfather. An elderly woman remembered the exact bench from the harbor scene and told Dolores how her late husband used to sketch from that same spot. Every conversation wove another thread into the story. Her art had not been silent after all. It had waited patiently in the dark, and now it was speaking through color, through memory, through the eyes of strangers who suddenly felt like family. Someone handed her a notebook, asking for her to sign a corner. She hesitated. "I've never signed anything like this." Keanu leaned in. "You don't have to sign it for them. Sign it for you." She wrote her name slowly, deliberately. Dolores Alvarez. Her hand trembled, not from weakness, from reverence. She had spent her life making other people feel at home. Now, for the first time, the world was opening its doors to her. They walked the room together, Keanu letting her take the lead. She paused at each piece as if meeting an old friend. Some she'd forgotten, others felt like dreams returning with vivid clarity. Near the end of the exhibit, there was a mirror, framed in soft gold, hanging beside her sketch of Keanu. Below the mirror, a card read, "What we give to others reflects who we are. This space reflects Dolores." She touched the mirror gently, and in the quiet moment that followed, she smiled. Not just because others saw her, but because she finally saw herself. After the initial wave of attention, Dolores found a quiet bench at the back of the gallery. Keanu joined her with 2 cups of tea, still warm from the gallery cafe. She cupped hers in both hands and looked around with the soft, overwhelmed calm of someone watching a dream unfold in real time. "I don't understand," she said softly. "How did they find beauty in all this? I was just documenting the little things." Keanu sipped his tea before answering. "That's exactly why it matters. The little things are what make a life. Anyone can paint a sunset, but only you could paint a torn shoelace and make someone cry." Dolores looked down, her eyes misty but steady. "For so long I thought maybe I imagined it. That it didn't matter. That I didn't matter. You mattered to me," Keanu said. "You still do." A silence fell between them. Deep, gentle, filled with shared memory. Then a young girl, no older than 12, approached shyly. She held a brochure from the gallery and pointed to a small print of Dolores's painting of a sleeping baby cradled in a laundry basket. "Did you draw this one?" she asked. Dolores nodded. "It's my favorite," the girl said. "It reminds me of my cousin." Dolores smiled. "He must be a beautiful baby." "Well, is, but he cries a lot," the girl added with a dramatic sigh. They both laughed, and Keanu watched them with something close to awe. It wasn't just the paintings that were changing people. It was Dolores herself. Her presence. Her quiet magic. Later, as the crowd thinned, the gallery owner approached with a modest envelope. Inside was a check. Sales from several prints that had been purchased quietly during the exhibit. Dolores stared at it as though it were written in another language. I never expected." "We'll only sell what you approve," the curator said gently. "But people are moved. They want to take a part of your story home with them." Dolores folded the envelope, her fingers trembling just a bit. "I don't need the money," she said. Keanu gently placed his hand over hers. "It's not about need, it's about worth. You gave something priceless, and the world is giving back." She looked around the room one more time. The lights, the paintings, the whispers of gratitude still drifting in the air. "I don't know what to say." "You already said it," Keanu replied. "You just said it with color." And as the gallery closed its doors for the evening, Dolores walked out with her head a little higher. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like someone in the background. She felt like the artist the world had waited to meet. 2 days after the gallery opening, Dolores received a call from Maya. "There's a bit of a line forming outside the gallery," she said with a light laugh. "People are asking if the artist might come by again." Dolores didn't know what to say. Her first instinct was to say no. She wasn't used to attention. But something inside her, a still, quiet voice, told her to go. So she did. She wore the same scarf Keanu had given her. He offered to walk with her, but she said no this time. She wanted to face whatever was waiting on her own. When she arrived, the sidewalk was dotted with people. Some were just passing by, curious about the buzz. But others had brought photos, old letters, folded newspaper clippings. They weren't just art lovers. They were memory holders. The first to approach was a man in his early 30s, with kind eyes and a slight limp. "Miss Dolores?" he asked, nervous. She nodded. "You taught me English when I was 9. My mom worked nights, and I was falling behind in school. You came over twice a week after you cleaned the house. I still remember how you made me read out loud until I didn't stutter anymore." Dolores stared at him, searching his face for the boy she once knew. "Samuel?" He smiled. "You remembered." She put her hands to her mouth, then hugged him. "You became so tall," she said through tears. "I became a teacher," he replied, "because of you." She didn't have words for that. Another woman approached, older, holding a photograph. "You helped me leave my husband," she said. "You hid me in the basement of that house on Gloucester Street while I waited for my sister to come from Ottawa. You gave me food, blankets. I never told anyone, but I never forgot." Dolores stared in disbelief. "I wasn't brave," she whispered. "Yes," the woman said. "You were." More came. A boy she used to walk home from school when his parents forgot. A grandmother who'd been too ill to cook in the winter of '88 and remembered Dolores sneaking her warm soup in a thermos. With every story, her past unraveled in reverse, like someone turning a mirror slowly back through time. She hadn't kept a record, she hadn't written a memoir, but somehow her life had been written in the lives of others, and now they were reading it back to her. Each face held a thread, each voice wove another line into the quiet tapestry she never knew she'd created. Inside the gallery, Maya had arranged a few chairs in the back where people could sit and speak with Dolores one-on-one. The crowd moved respectfully. No one pushed, no one shouted. It wasn't a frenzy. It was a homecoming. A couple in their 60s sat down across from her next. The woman held an old notebook, its edges torn, pages yellowed with age. "You used to babysit my brother and me while our parents fought upstairs," the woman said softly. "You used to hum to us when we couldn't sleep. This is your handwriting." She handed over the notebook. Dolores flipped it open, and there it was. Her looping, careful script. Simple words. Gentle rhymes. She had written poems for the children to recite. Nothing fancy, just verses about kindness, flowers, and bedtime stars. "I haven't seen this in 40 years, Dolores whispered. "We've kept it," the man said. "All this time. It reminded us that someone cared, even when it felt like the world didn't." A young man with a camera waited his turn, then sat across from her with quiet reverence. "I was hired to photograph the exhibit," he said. "At first it was just a job, but then I read the placards. I saw the painting of the cracked kitchen tiles, the one with the sunlight streaming through. That was my house." Dolores blinked. "My grandmother cleaned there. She used to tell me about the nice lady with the long braid who always smiled but looked tired. That was you." Dolores felt her throat tighten. "I just wanted to say, my grandmother passed last year, but if she were here, she'd thank you. So I'm doing it for her." He stood, shook her hand, and left without asking for a photo. One after another, the stories kept coming. From the woman who remembered Dolores helping her pronounce her first job interview lines. From the man who used to see her sitting quietly at the church, knitting hats for strangers. From the teen who once stole from the grocery store where Dolores worked, briefly, and remembered her telling him, instead of yelling, "This isn't who you are, you're better than this." He'd gone on to become a youth counselor. With every encounter, Dolores grew quieter, but never colder. Her eyes glistened with the weight of it all. It wasn't fame. It wasn't spectacle. It was confirmation that a life lived gently, consistently, and with love had echoed louder than she ever imagined. As the afternoon light shifted through the gallery windows, Dolores finally stood, her legs steady now beneath the quiet tide of gratitude. The visitors had thinned, but a few lingered, watching her with the kind of warmth usually reserved for beloved family. Keanu appeared near the entrance. He had waited, giving her space to meet her past without the weight of his presence. Dolores walked toward him, her eyes still wet, her hands folded gently in front of her. "I didn't know," she said. "I did," Keanu answered softly, "but only a part of it. I thought I was just doing what needed to be done." "You were," he said, "and you were changing people's lives while doing it." She looked back at the gallery, at the space now filled with paintings, voices, memories. "I spent so many years thinking I was invisible." "You were the one who made everyone else feel seen," he said. "Now it's your turn." Dolores nodded slowly, the weight of decades releasing from her shoulders, not all at once, but in pieces, like snow melting off a roof in spring. Maya approached, carrying a small guest book filled with notes left by visitors. "They've written messages," she said. "Would you like to read some?" Dolores flipped it open. Each page held quiet testimonies, gratitude, memories, tears. Some were from people she remembered, others from strangers who had only seen her art, felt its depth, and been moved enough to write. One read, "I never knew who cleaned our home when I was a kid. I wish it had been someone like you." Another, "You reminded me of my grandmother. Thank you for making the world feel gentle again." She closed the book slowly and held it to her chest. It wasn't pride that filled her, it was peace. Keanu gently walked her to the car. As they drove away, she watched the gallery grow smaller in the window, but something inside her had expanded. At the next stoplight, she turned to him and said, "You know what I regret?" "What's that?" "That I didn't believe in myself sooner." Keanu smiled. "You gave so much to everyone else. Sometimes it takes a little time for the world to catch up and give it back." She turned toward the road again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's too late?" "No," he said. "I think you just started your second act." And in that quiet car, between city blocks she'd once walked with tired feet, Dolores Alvarez leaned back into her seat, folded her hands in her lap, and smiled. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking back with regret. She was looking forward with purpose. A month after the gallery show, Keanu sat at a roundtable meeting in downtown Toronto, surrounded by a small team from a nonprofit called Bright Futures. Their mission had always been to support marginalized youth, but now, with Keanu's quiet funding and direction, a new branch was being born. He proposed the name gently, without fanfare. "The Dolores Alvarez Scholarship," he said, "for children of domestic workers, cleaners, caregivers, the ones who hold everything together but are never seen." The room went still for a moment. Then nods followed, some fast, some slow, but all deeply certain. Within weeks, the foundation was launched. Paperwork was signed, partnerships were built. A modest launch event was organized. No red carpet, no media circus. Just real people, real families, and one woman whose life had finally stepped out from the shadows. Dolores had no idea Keanu had named the scholarship after her. She arrived at the event in a dark blue dress, holding tightly to the small purse she'd owned for years. Maya met her at the door, beaming, and led her inside. The venue was humble, an old community center turned bright with string lights and simple banners. One stood taller than the rest, placed just behind the podium. It read, "The Dolores Alvarez Scholarship. Because quiet work builds strong futures." Her hand went to her chest. Is this mine?" Keanu stepped forward, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "No, it's theirs," he said, motioning to the children and families around the room. "But it carries your name, because you carried so many of us." She didn't cry this time. She nodded. She walked toward the chairs near the front, still observing the moment. Her name wasn't written in pencil anymore. It wasn't hidden in someone else's diary or lost beneath years of unpaid kindness. It was up front, bold, and permanent. Before the speeches began, a young woman approached with her 2 sons. She introduced herself as Clara, a single mother who had cleaned houses for 15 years. "My oldest wants to study engineering," she said. "We didn't know how we'd manage. But this gives us hope." Dolores looked at the boys, and said, "Then hold on to that hope. Tight." Keanu took the podium first. He spoke simply, without script. He told the crowd that success often rests on invisible shoulders. That when he was a boy, he thought strength meant being alone, but that it was Dolores's quiet presence that taught him how to stand tall. "I owe much of my life," he said, "to someone the world never noticed, and it's time that changed." When Keanu stepped down, he gave Dolores a quiet nod. She froze in her chair. Her hands trembled slightly. Maya gave her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder and whispered, "Just be yourself. That's always been more than enough." Dolores stood. She walked to the podium slowly, her pace measured and calm, like someone holding something precious inside. The room fell silent. She looked out across the rows of chairs. Families, children, teachers, workers with tired hands and hopeful eyes. It was the kind of crowd she had once belonged to invisibly. Now they were all looking at her. She took a breath. "I've cleaned homes for over 60 years, she began. "And in that time, I've heard a lot of things. Music through closed doors, arguments that ended in hugs, babies crying, laughter over spilled soup. You learn the rhythm of a home without ever being part of it." She paused, steady now. "You learn how to disappear into corners, make yourself small so other people can be big. That was my job, and I did it with love." A few heads bowed, a few hands gripped tighter to their children's. "But tonight," she continued, "you've given me something I never expected. A place in the room, a voice, a name on a wall." The applause was quiet at first, just a ripple. Then it grew. She held up one hand gently, waiting for it to calm. "I never wanted credit," she said. "Most of us don't. We do what we do because we must, because we believe in what comes after. Our children, your children, a better tomorrow." Her voice didn't tremble anymore. It filled the room. "I didn't finish school. I never had savings. I lost my husband young and raised my daughter with 2 hands and 3 jobs. But I always believed that goodness counted for something, even if no one saw it." She looked toward the scholarship banner again. "And now, maybe someone does." The applause this time was louder, longer. It didn't fade. People stood. Keanu stood. Even Maya wiped her eyes. Dolores blinked fast but smiled. "Thank you," she said, "not just for this honor, but for proving that it's never too late to be seen." She stepped down as the room filled with warmth, with reverence. A community that had known silence for so long now stood united in celebration. Behind her, the banner still waved gently under the low hum of ceiling fans. Her name, her legacy, carved not in marble or money, but in lives, opened, doors unlocked, and futures now possible. After the event, as people lingered in the hall, Dolores stood by a table where the first scholarship applications were already being filled out. A mother approached her, clutching a pen and blinking back tears. "My daughter wants to be a doctor," she said. "I clean hotel rooms. I never thought she'd get the chance." Dolores reached across the table and gently placed her hand over the mother's. "She will," she said. "And when she does, you'll have built that dream with your hands." Nearby, Keanu quietly observed the interactions. He didn't take pictures, didn't ask for attention. He just watched as something he had long hoped for began to unfold, change, seeded by memory. Outside, the sky was turning orange with dusk. The event had officially ended, but no one was in a rush to leave. Volunteers served warm drinks, children laughed under the string lights, and a string quartet played soft music in the background. But the loudest sound was unspoken, the sound of dignity being restored. Later that night, as they drove home, Dolores sat quietly beside Keanu in the back seat. "You know," she said, "I used to worry that I hadn't done enough." "You did more than enough," Keanu replied. "You just didn't get the credit." She looked out the window, her reflection barely visible in the glass. "This scholarship, It's not really for me. It's for all of us. For every woman who walked home with sore feet and quiet dreams. And it will carry them forward, he said. She smiled. Then it's more than I ever hoped for. Back at her apartment, she stepped inside and paused by the front door. The flowers from the event sat on her table. The guest book was open beside them, a ribbon marking one of the pages, where someone had written, "Thank you for making invisible work feel seen." Dolores sat down, slowly. She reached into her purse and took out a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing she had made years ago, long before anyone had asked her to speak, or honor her, or hang her art in a gallery. It was a sketch of a small child, asleep on a couch. The boy's head rested on a book. His socks were mismatched. His smile faint but peaceful. She had titled it quietly, in the corner, Hope Unnoticed. Now, that hope had a name, a building, a banner, a legacy. And she, Dolores Alvarez, no longer wondered whether her story mattered. She knew, because now it was written, not only in memory, but in motion. It was a crisp morning in Toronto, the kind of morning where the air held just enough bite to keep people in their coats a little longer. At the small neighborhood park, nestled between two quiet streets, birds gathered around a weathered bench. They weren't afraid. They had grown used to the woman who came every week with a paper bag of breadcrumbs and a calm voice. Dolores Alvarez sat on that bench again. Her scarf was tucked neatly beneath her coat, and her gloved hands held a little paper bag on her lap. She opened it slowly, crumbling bread between her fingers as she scattered crumbs along the concrete path. The birds hopped forward eagerly. A few brave ones landed on the bench beside her. She smiled softly. A child's voice laughed from behind. Two kids chased each other around the swing set, their parents chatting nearby. One of the boys waved to Dolores as he ran past. She waved back. This wasn't new. The neighborhood had changed, but the bench and the birds, they remained. So did her quiet routine. But today was different. Today, Keanu Reeves joined her. He approached without fanfare, no cameras, no handlers, just a quiet presence walking across the grass toward the bench. She glanced up and smiled. "You made it." "I said I would," he replied, lowering himself beside her. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the birds peck and flutter. Dolores handed him a slice of bread. "Break it with your fingers," she said. "Not too fast. They don't trust quick movements." He followed her instructions. Soon, a small gray sparrow hopped near his boot. "Really remember kindness," she said. "Even if it's small." He nodded. "So do people." A breeze swept through the park, rustling the trees above them. Dolores looked out across the playground, the paths, the familiar shapes of the buildings that framed her daily walks. "I've been coming here for years," she said, "even when I worked 12-hour days. This bench was my break, my one piece of stillness." "You gave so much to everyone else," Keanu said. "You deserved a place that gave something back." She shook her head, gently. "I never needed much, just time. Time to think. Time to feel human again." He looked at her hands, the soft lines, the quiet strength in the way she held the paper bag, like it mattered. "What did you think about?" he asked. She turned her gaze toward the birds. "Memories, people I'd cared for, your mother, you." Keanu looked down, eyes soft. "You are always there," he said. "Every time I fell apart, you were just there." "I didn't have words back then," she replied. "Just presence. Sometimes that's enough." A nearby baby started crying, and Dolores smiled faintly. "That sound used to scare me when I first came to this country. I thought it meant something was wrong. But now I know it just means someone is growing." Keanu smiled. "You helped me grow in more ways than you'll ever know." Dolores leaned back. "Funny, isn't it? You never really know what someone will remember." Keanu let the silence settle before speaking. "I remember your stew," The one you made when I was sick? I remember the way you used to hum in the kitchen when you thought no one was listening. And I remember your hands, how steady they were when I was scared." Dolores blinked slowly. "I never thought anyone would remember the way I loved." He looked at her. "But I never forgot." They sat like that for a long time. The wind moved through the trees, the sky brightened, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed the hour. Neither of them moved. Finally, Dolores reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded napkin. She handed it to Keanu. "I drew something again," she said, almost shyly. He opened it carefully. It was a sketch of the bench, 2 figures seated side by side, birds at their feet, trees overhead, the moment captured with simple lines and quiet grace. He studied it, then looked at her. "You still see the world better than most people ever learn to." "I see what matters," she said. Keanu carefully tucked the drawing into his jacket pocket. "I'm going to frame this," she chuckled. "Then hang it somewhere quiet, somewhere it won't get lost in noise." "Promise," he said. Another silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of memories, gratitude, and things too big for words. Then Dolores said, "Do you think people ever realize when their life has already changed?" Keanu thought for a moment. "Maybe not in the moment, but I think we feel it, in our bones, in quiet mornings like this." She nodded slowly. "Then, this must be one of those mornings." Keanu stood and offered her his hand. She took it, rising gently. "Let's walk," he said. And so they did. Slowly, with no rush, no destination. Just a man and a woman who once shared a home, now sharing a morning. The birds followed behind them in bursts. A few children called out cheerful goodbyes. But the bench remained behind, still, waiting, like it always had. And if someone were to pass by later that day, they might find a few breadcrumbs left on the path, soft impressions in the earth, and a memory, invisible but present, a memory of kindness, a memory of being seen. And that, in the end, was the legacy Dolores never asked for, but finally received. The call came early in the morning. There was no urgency in the voice, no panic, just a quiet, respectful stillness. Dolores Alvarez had passed in her sleep, peacefully. No pain, just gone. Keanu sat at the edge of his bed, holding the phone to his ear in silence long after the call had ended. The sun hadn't yet risen, but he didn't move to turn on the light. He didn't need to see. He just needed to feel it. She was gone, but somehow not really. A week later, friends and strangers gathered in the same small park where Dolores had fed birds and told stories with her eyes. There was no cathedral, no grand venue, just a circle of chairs, a soft breeze, and a table covered in photos, sketches, and a bouquet of wildflowers. Keanu stood at the center, holding a folded letter in his hand. He cleared his throat, then began. "She wrote me this just a few weeks ago," he said. "I didn't know she'd be gone so soon, but she must have felt something. She always knew more than she said." He unfolded the letter and read, "Dear Keanu, if you're reading this, I've already found my peace. I hope you're not too sad. Life gave me more than I ever expected, especially in the end. You reminded me that dignity doesn't fade with age. It just needs a little light to be seen again. Thank you for giving me that light." Keanu paused. He looked around at the gathered faces. Some he recognized from the gallery show, others who had written to Dolores after hearing her speak, and a few local families who had once received her quiet help in difficult times. "She went on," Keanu said, his voice steady. "She said," he read again, "I never thought I'd be remembered for anything but cleaning floors, but now I know, kindness does leave footprints. Even when we walk in silence." A breeze passed through the park. The birds, as if on cue, fluttered down from the trees and landed near the bench. Keanu continued, "She asked me for one last favor. to place something small at the bench, something that wouldn't draw too much attention, something quiet, like her. He stepped aside and motioned toward the edge of the concrete path. There, just beneath the bench where she once sat each week, was a small bronze plaque. It gleamed in the morning light. For Dolores Alvarez, who quietly held the world together. No music played, no speeches followed. The silence said enough. People began to step forward, one by one. Some laid flowers, others pressed their hands to the bench or paused with bowed heads. A young boy left a piece of bread beside the plaque, and slowly, gently, the space filled with the only kind of mourning Dolores would have ever allowed, one filled with respect, humility, and soft gratitude. After the service, Keanu remained behind while most people drifted away. He sat alone on the bench, the one she had made sacred just by returning to it, week after week. He didn't say anything aloud. He didn't need to. He reached into his coat and pulled out the sketch she had given him. 2 figures, birds, and that unmistakable peace. He rested it in his lap and stared ahead at the trees she used to talk to like old friends. His voice interrupted the stillness. Who helped my mother when no one else would? It was a woman in her late 30s. She stood beside the bench, holding a small girl's hand. I just wanted to say thank you. Keanu nodded softly. She helped so many people. I don't think we'll ever know how many. More people came, not as mourners, but as ripples. A man whose first English lesson came from Dolores. A teacher who had once been one of her art students before she gave it up. A man who had once lived in her building and said she taught him how to boil rice when he was too ashamed to ask. Each one left something, flowers, drawings, notes. Each one proved the truth of her life, even without fame, even without fortune. Dolores Alvarez had created a legacy. Later that day, Keanu returned to her apartment for the last time. The staff had already begun packing her things with care. He stepped into the small living room and stood silently in the doorway. There was a note taped to the wall above her favorite chair. It read, "If you find this, don't cry. Just remember that I lived exactly how I wanted, quiet, kind, and surrounded by love. That's more than enough." Beside the chair sat a stack of sketches she hadn't shared. Scenes from the park, birds, a boy reading by a window, and one last unfinished piece, a sketch of the gallery, with faces in the crowd that hadn't been filled in yet. Keanu picked it up and held it for a long time. That night, he framed the drawing and hung it in his own home, just above the bookshelf where he kept the photo albums from his childhood. And he visited the park often, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, but always with bread in his pocket. The plaque remained, the birds returned, and now and then someone new would stop to read the words and ask, who was she? And someone would answer, not always with her name, but with a story about kindness, a story about how one woman gave the world more than it ever gave back. Dolores had once worried she hadn't done enough, but in the end, she left behind something few ever do, a life that quietly made others believe in goodness again. And that was everything. Sometimes we forget the people who made us. Not the ones with awards or famous names, but the ones whose names were never spoken on stages. The ones who opened doors quietly, folded our clothes, wiped our tears, without asking for anything in return. The people who showed up, day after day, not because they were paid well, but because they believed love was an action. Dolores Alvarez was one of those people. She wasn't famous. She didn't build skyscrapers or run companies, but she built lives. One child at a time, one family at a time, one small kindness at a time. For years, I thought of her only in passing, a scent that reminded me of home, or a song she used to hum. I didn't know how much she had given until I saw her again, wiping a glass door with hands that once held me steady, when the world felt too big. Her life wasn't easy. She faced grief, poverty, loneliness, and still she gave. She gave until the end. We live in a world that moves fast, that praises the loudest voice and forgets the quietest hands. But what if we stopped? What if, just for a moment, we looked back? What if we remembered the people who shaped us when we had nothing to offer in return? Think of the person who helped raise you. Maybe it was a neighbor, a teacher, a nurse. Maybe it was a housekeeper who stayed late because your mother was working a second job. Maybe it was someone like Dolores, someone whose love lived in small, faithful moments. Reach out to them. If they're still here, say thank you. And if they're gone, say their name out loud. Tell their story. Make sure the world knows they mattered. We often wait too long to say what should have been said every day, that they made a difference, that their care wasn't invisible. I've learned that legacy isn't what we leave behind when we're gone. It's what we give away while we're still here. Dolores gave her art, her time, her hands, her heart, and all she ever wanted was to be useful. She didn't need to be seen. But when we finally saw her, really saw her, something beautiful happened. The world paused and listened. That moment changed me. It reminded me that behind every great story is a quiet soul who helped it begin. So I want to ask you something, not just as a viewer, but as someone who carries a name like Dolores in their own heart, who helped raise you that the world forgot. Was it your grandmother who packed your school lunch even when she had none for herself? Was it the janitor who stayed behind to fix your broken bike chain in the rain? Was it a neighbor who spoke your name with kindness when the world called you invisible? Think of them now. Picture their face. Remember their voice, their warmth, their sacrifice. And if you're comfortable, I invite you to share their name in the comments below. Let's make this more than just a video. Let's make it a space where the forgotten are finally remembered. You can just write, "For Rosa, who never stopped believing in me," or for Mr. Patel, who taught me English after school every day, or even just for my mom, who held the whole house together with tired hands. Let their names fill this space with something real, with memory, with meaning, because they deserve that. And if you're someone who's walking in their shoes now, if you're cleaning homes, watching other people's children, caring quietly while the world looks the other way, I want you to hear this. You matter. You are not invisible. You are building something every day that the world desperately needs. Love, stability, kindness. You are the reason someone out there will one day say, "I made it because someone believed in me." So today, let's honor that. Let's reach out to those who shaped us, even in silence. Call them, visit them, thank them, and if you can, give back in a way that restores their dignity, just like Dolores's was restored. It doesn't have to be grand. Sometimes, remembering someone with kindness is the biggest gift you can give. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What story should we share next? Whose quiet heroism needs to be heard? Your suggestion could be the next name we speak, the next story we tell. Because every story like this matters. Every life like Dolores's deserves to be more than a passing memory. Let's make sure it's not just remembered, but celebrated. Thank you for watching. And thank you, Dolores Alvarez, for showing us that love, even in silence, leaves a mark nothing can erase.